Is decline inevitable for all organizations? I mean, does everything, even something as deeply rooted as a church denomination, just follow a natural life cycle that ends in decline?
It's a question that haunts a lot of longstanding institutions, isn't it? That feeling that maybe there's a natural arc. You're born, you grow, mature, and then, well, you fade.
And that's the big question. Our source material for this deep dive really grabs onto immediately. We've got a text here that looks at denominations that the author says has stopped being dynamic movements.
Right.
And it asks very directly, can that downward spiral actually be reversed?
It really challenges that idea that the cycle must end in decline. So the core mission of this text and, our deep dive here is to figure out what stands in the way of that reversal.
What are the roadblocks?
Exactly. And what proactive steps the source suggests to help a denomination become a movement again.
So for you listening, whether you're involved in a church denomination or, frankly, any established organization trying to navigate change, this text offers some really specific, maybe uncomfortable, but fascinating insights.
Yeah, into the roadblocks and the potential path forward. It gives us a framework sort of for looking at where institutions get stuck.
And how they might get unstuck.
Right, what it might actually take.
Okay, let's unpack this. The source starts by acknowledging that familiar cycle you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
New life, growth, maturity, and then, decline. It sees that pattern.
Sure, it acknowledges it.
But its central question, its challenge, is whether that decline phase is truly inevitable for churches that were once these vibrant movements.
That's the pivot point. The source isn't just observing decline, it's arguing it doesn't have to be the end. Its specific focus is on those denominations it describes as being stalled as movements.
Can they genuinely turn things around?
And if not, what's holding them back? That's the core question.
And the source doesn't pull any punches here. It lays out what it sees as the specific, fundamental obstacles.
It even calls them big rocks, things standing squarely in the path.
These aren't minor hurdles, then.
No, the source identifies 8 major areas, deeply embedded stuff that must be confronted head-on if a denomination hopes to, rediscover that movement dynamic.
Let's dive into some of these.
Yeah.
The first one the source highlights is almost, counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Success. How can success be a problem?
Yeah, this is where the source really challenges our usual thinking. It asks, is it truly success if your big church building in a city of, say, 450,000 only has 20 regulars?
Or if the denominational tithes just manage to cover pastoral costs and internal obligations.
Right. Or, if a denomination pats itself on the back saying, well, our schools are doing okay, budgets are balanced, and membership decline has slowed down.
Okay, so those look like wins on paper.
They might indicate good management, keeping the lights on, balancing the books, but the source argues very forcefully that these are not the metrics of a movement. And this perceived success, this maybe effective management of decline, is actually a massive trap. It leads straight to complacency.
You feel successful by your own definition.
Exactly. While by a movement definition, you're basically stagnant or, dying.
It's a powerful distinction. Managing decline effectively isn't the same as fostering new life. Okay, and this seems tied directly to the next obstacle the source names, comfort.
Absolutely. Comfort comes from being established, right? Denominations have solid offices. Members often have deep emotional and financial investment in buildings.
And the source notes this isn't just a Western thing. These large, often costly building models get replicated globally.
Creates a sense of security, yeah. The source even draws a parallel to the Laodicean church in Revelation, that feeling of being rich, self-sufficient.
Maybe blinding them to a deeper need.
Exactly. And that comfort often comes with a pretty significant debt burden. Maintaining those structures, paying that debt, becomes a huge distraction.
Time, energy.
Resources. Pulls it all away from core movement activities like actually making disciples and planting new churches.
Which feeds straight into the next obstacle. Consumerism. We live in a society where, we pay for services.
And the source notes how this attitude creeps right into the church. Members start to expect a kind of payback for their contributions.
So subsidized events, resources, pastors. They feel entitled because they've paid their tithes or offerings.
That's the idea. It creates that pay and pray dynamic the source talks about. Members expect the professionals, the pastors, the staff to do the actual disciple-making, the mission work.
And the source says this system, even though it's been around for decades, needs to be significantly dialed back.
Yeah, dialed back. So resources and energy can be freed up for actual movement stuff. Instead of embodying the mission, People are paying others to do it for them.
Which connects to obstacle number 4, institutionalism.
More comfort here, but this time from having, flourishing denominational schools or health systems or other institutions built up over time.
Right, and the concern is,
The source worries that a local church might look at a nearby denominational school and think, okay, our mission to this community is covered, even if there's little real connection.
even if the church isn't really reaching out through that school.
Exactly. It uses the example of maybe a school chaplain's ministry leading to a few baptisms, often from existing member families, which gets celebrated. And that's good, but...
But it's not a discipleship movement reaching the wider community.
Precisely. And the source also observes that some parts of the denomination can become so dependent on these institutions. Hospitals, companies, schools for funding, for identity even.
That managing the deep emotional investments in them becomes a massive hurdle.
Yeah, it makes shifting focus towards a more dynamic movement vision really, really hard.
Okay, obstacle number 5, complexity. This feels almost unavoidable in any large, long-established organization.
Oh, definitely. Layer upon layer. At the denominational level, you've got all sorts of companies, multiple departments, complex policies, deeply entrenched interests built up over decades, sometimes centuries.
Wow. And at the local church level?
The source points out the pastor's job description has basically become everything, which leads to administrators and pastors being utterly swamped.
Overloaded, tired.
Exhausted, frazzled, pressured, just trying to keep the existing system running.
So where's the space or energy for innovation? For trying something new?
Exactly. For revisiting and actually implementing the methods of Jesus for multiplication. Plus, the source adds a crucial point. Very few people have actually been trained for disciple-making, church planting, or movement thinking in the first place.
Which brings us neatly to obstacle number 6, events. You mentioned needing space for innovation, but the source observes leaders, staff members can become conference and study tour junkies.
Yeah, those events can be inspiring, absolutely. Study tours can offer great insights, nothing wrong with that in itself. But the source sees a pattern where there's often little or no time for implementation between one event and the next.
So you're constantly getting inspired by new ideas.
But not actually putting the previous ideas into practice. The source contrasts this sharply with how movements train people.
How so?
It says movement training is hands-on, field-based coaching and mentoring, focused directly on disciple-making and church planting. It calls for much greater accountability around events.
Like assessing their actual value, demanding action plans.
Yes, clear action plans, follow-up, reporting back on what actually happened as a result, not just having the event.
So events become ends in themselves, rather than fuel for action.
Got it. Obstacle 7, organization. The source calls this a really big rock.
Yeah, this sounds like it goes much deeper than just rearranging the org chart slightly.
Like tweaking.
Much deeper. The source argues that if denominations want to become movements again, they need different organizational structures entirely. Now, it's careful to say movements do need structure.
It calls it organic functional complexity, right? Not just chaos.
Right. Structure is needed, but the reorganization required is presented as far more than just tweaking the edges. The source uses the phrase total rewrite.
A total rewrite.
A fundamental shift from control to partnership structures. This impacts everything and everyone.
How so?
It means moving away from a mindset focused on administration and departmental silos towards what it calls movement leadership. And managing that kind of shift, it requires a really comprehensive, carefully planned change process.
Okay. Finally, obstacle number 8, funding.
Right. The source acknowledges that while some low-cost church planting models exist, sometimes called $0 church planting, meaning they don't rely heavily on external funding.
Money is still needed for movements.
Yes, the source says money is needed, but it needs to be fundamentally reallocated. Funds have to shift dramatically.
Away from
maintaining existing offices, structures, departments, and towards grassroots hands-on equipping. Investing directly in the people doing the actual work of disciple-making and church planting on the ground.
So it suggests a plan. Yeah, developing maybe a clear 3 to 5 year plan that shows exactly how funds will be reallocated, showing how changes to structures will free up money to actually fund movement leadership and equipping. It's about putting your money where your movement is, basically.
Okay, so if we look at these 8 rocks together, success, comfort, consumerism, institutionalism, complexity, events, organization, and funding.
The source is pretty blunt. They are massive. They all involve people's jobs, identities.
And you have to address them proactively.
Yeah. Ignoring them, the source says, is guaranteed to derail any attempt at revitalization.
Wow. That is a comprehensive and honestly pretty sobering picture of the challenges. It really makes you understand why turning things around is so difficult.
It does. But the source doesn't just leave us there with the problems. It also lays out what it sees as a proactive plan.
Okay.
It suggests 4 key conditions necessary for revitalization.
Moving from problems to solutions then.
Right. The 4 conditions are: 1, leaders must face up to reality. 2, focus must shift to the key parts. 3, movement catalysts, even unexpected ones, need to be encouraged. And 4, essential qualities must be cultivated.
Facing reality, that sounds like the antidote to that complacency we talked about earlier. What does the source mean by that, specifically?
It means taking a really honest look. Admitting if membership has plateaued, the source says flat out, if it has, you are no longer a movement. Period.
Ouch.
Yeah. It means rigorously checking how funds are actually being used. Is it just for maintenance, keeping the system going, or is it genuinely fostering movement?
And assessing church planting rates.
Right. The source suggests a healthy sign is planting the equivalent of 10% of your existing churches across your region every year. And it gets very specific about evaluating the state of local churches, too.
How specific?
It talks about surveying every single church in an area. How many are genuinely at risk of dying? How many have no clear vision for the future? How many have a vision but aren't growing? And crucially, how many are actually reproducing themselves by planting new churches?
So really getting granular.
Yeah, it even suggests using a simple graph to map churches based on leadership, resources, vision, just to get a clear, unvarnished picture of the reality on the ground.
Facing reality. Okay. Condition number 2 is focusing on the essential parts.
And here, the source is very direct. It says the core essential entities in the New Testament church model were local churches and church planting teams.
Not denominational headquarters.
Nope.
Not complex structures.
Nope. Not the HQ, not the structures. The source emphasizes that revitalization will not happen by pouring more resources into HQ or by trying to strengthen existing structures and policies.
So the focus, the energy, the investment has to shift. Where?
Back to empowering and multiplying those local expressions of the church, the ones on the front lines.
And it puts a really strong responsibility on denominational leaders here.
Huge. Saying they must get on board with championing and resourcing these key local entities. If they don't, well, the source warns pretty pointedly, the denomination itself might just die while the next wave of movement happens completely outside of its walls.
Wow. That leads us to a really fascinating, maybe initially unsettling point in the source. Who are the key catalysts for these movements?
This really grabbed my attention too. The source argues that if you look at history, new movements are often initiated and driven by the disenfranchised.
The disgruntled, those pushed to the fringes or margins of the established power structures.
Exactly. Breakthroughs happen on the fringes, the source states, never at the center.
So the implication for established leaders is pretty radical.
Yeah. They need to realign their support to actually affirm and encourage the people not currently holding the power, because the source believes that disinherited will be the ones who will drive renewal.
That requires, as the source notes, patient and humble leadership.
Definitely. Because those people on the fringes, they might have been critical, maybe even harsh, in their assessments of the way things are currently done.
So engaging with them, empowering them, it's presented as a bitter pill for those in control.
A bitter pill, yeah. But framed as absolutely essential. High risk, yes, because it involves engaging with critique and empowering those outside the traditional power base.
But the source is clear. These are the very ones needed for renewal. It goes so far as to say movements have only ever been initiated by the disinherited.
That is a profound and challenging idea, relevant for pretty much any long-established group seeking real renewal. It completely flips the script on where you look for leadership and energy.
Okay. The 4th condition the source outlines is cultivating essential movement qualities.
Right, and this section draws on qualities of historical mission movements, referencing Steve Addison's work as identified in the source. There are 5 non-negotiables.
What are they?
First, white-hot faith. Movements don't start with strategic plans or big budgets. They begin with people who have a deep, genuine encounter with God and fully surrender their lives.
Okay.
Second, commitment to a cause. For people in a movement, nothing is more important than Jesus and his mission-making disciples, planting churches, building the kingdom movement. It's the driving force.
Third,
contagious relationships. Movements spread organically, person to person, usually through existing social networks, and they feel at home in their existing culture. They aren't foreign implants.
fourth,
Rapid mobilization. New disciples don't just sit in spinning for years. They quickly become leaders themselves who then reach new people and multiply churches. And the source specifically points out,
what?
none of this is centrally planned, funded, or controlled. It's decentralized. It's viral.
Interesting. And fifth,
Adaptive methods. The structures and methods used in a movement are purely functional. They serve the mission. They need to be adaptable, flexible, and transferable, which means they require constant revision for mission.
so not rigid traditions, but tools that can be changed.
Exactly, tools that serve the mission. And the source is incredibly clear on these five. They are essential, non-optional. There is no movement without these five characteristics. They're like the DNA.
Okay, so we've mapped the major obstacles and the necessary conditions and qualities. That still leaves the big question: where do you actually start implementing the kind of radical change the source seems to be talking about? It sounds huge.
It is huge, and the source acknowledges that without intentional leadership, things like vision leaks, mission drift, stagnation, they're almost guaranteed. It states very clearly that revitalization is only possible with determined, intentional leadership driving a specific set of actions.
And these actions tie directly back to everything we've just discussed, presumably.
Precisely. Key leadership must cast a clear movement vision. All leaders must proactively and personally model and foster those five essential movement qualities we just talked about.
Has to be lived out.
Absolutely. You have to intentionally cultivate a broad-based disciple-making movement among the people. You must launch a multiplying church planting movement using models that are simple and reproducible.
And, critically,
Yeah.
tackle the obstacles.
Yes. All those 8 major obstacles we identified earlier have to be systematically and proactively tackled. You can't just launch new initiatives and hope the old problems magically sort themselves out.
Right.
And finally, the source states, a radical, confronting, and extremely uncomfortable change process must be initiated, carefully managed, and actually seen through to completion.
That sounds intense.
It is. This process includes necessary retraining of people and significant reallocation of funds, and the source stresses these two aspects must move together. It can't be one without the other.
And it frames this whole challenging process as what?
As a return to the methods of Jesus, really, as illustrated in the book of Acts, a return to that grassroots, disciple-making, church-multiplying focus.
It sounds like it demands really deep-seated paradigm shifts. Like, the source implies administrators needing to become movement leaders, or maybe church pastors seeing themselves as catalysts for multiplying churches across their whole district.
Yes, exactly, that kind of fundamental reorientation. And the source notes that effective communication throughout this process, sharing the vision, explaining the changes, telling the stories of breakthrough, is absolutely vital. It's not just tweaking the structure, it's a cultural and operational transformation.
This has been incredibly insightful, really laying bare the challenges, but also providing a clear framework for action straight from the source material. Let's bring this back to you listening. This isn't just abstract theory. The source itself prompts reflection.
Yeah, we can reframe some of those ideas as questions for you to consider, based only on the concepts we've explored from this text.
Okay, first, thinking about your own experiences or observations in established organizations, are there any further obstacles you've seen? Things that prevent groups from revitalizing or becoming more dynamic, maybe obstacles that weren't explicitly in the 8 from this source.
In considering that call to face reality, how might you go about honestly assessing the actual health of established groups you're connected to? Using the source's kind of criteria, are they thriving and reproducing, just surviving, actually at risk? What's the unvarnished reality in your context?
What about that idea of the disinherited leading change? Who might fit that description in a church, a company, or any organization you know? Could it be, say, younger generations, people in certain roles, maybe women, others? And if a new wave of energy or change started among them, based on this source's thinking, how ready do you think the established structure would really be to genuinely affirm, learn from, and participate?
And reflecting on those 5 essential characteristics of movements, that white-hot faith, commitment, relationships, rapid mobilization, adaptive methods, how might you, just in your own sphere of influence, intentionally work to cultivate maybe just 1 or 2 of those qualities in a group or project you're involved with?
Finally, based on the source describing that radical, confronting, and extremely uncomfortable change process, what specific uncomfortable changes do you think might be necessary? In an organization you know well, if you were to seriously attempt shifting towards a more dynamic, movement-oriented approach,
Hmm.
what's the hardest truth that might need facing?
We've really taken a deep dive into this source's powerful perspective on revitalizing established church denominations. We've journeyed through those significant obstacles it identifies.
From the tricky traps of misplaced success and comfort, to the deep inertia of institutionalism, the burden of complexity, the distraction of constant events.
Right. And we've explored the challenging but proactive path forward it presents. The need for courageously facing uncomfortable reality, the critical shift to focus on foundational local entities.
The striking idea that catalysts often emerge from the fringes, the non-negotiable nature of cultivating core movement qualities.
And that unavoidable call for implementing a radical managed change process that touches absolutely everything.
Understanding these dynamics as this text illuminates them gives us a really potent lens, I think. It's not just for looking at religious organizations. It offers insights into health and potential renewal in many kinds of long-established groups that might be struggling with stagnation, especially in our rapidly changing world.
Absolutely. And perhaps the most provocative thought from this source to leave you with, the idea that challenges established thinking most directly, is this. If genuine revitalization movements historically kick off on the fringes, often spearheaded by those who feel outside the traditional centers of power, what does that imply about the essential wisdom, maybe even the necessity of intentionally seeking out, listening to, and empowering voices far from the mainstream in any organization that truly desires profound, life-giving change?